Hey there, how there, ho there, Chef Cutter Diamond. Welcome you to yet another Cutter Top 10 video. And today we're going to be looking at the top 10 worst NHL trades of all time. Yesterday we took a look at the top 10 best NHL trades from the perspective of the team that actually got the player. And now we're going to be looking at the worst trades from the perspective of the traders. Just to let you know that uh, 5 of the 10 trades on this list were actually covering the best NHL trades of all time. So they'll get the perspective from the team that traded them. And of course, the other 5 we'll do more in detail. Okay, here we go. Number 10 is Doug Gilmour to the Leafs from the Calgary Flames, 1992. So Calgary had Doug Gilmour after he started his career with the Blues. He was good. He helped them win the 1988 Stanley Cup. He did win He was named the game-winning goal in the Stanley Cup was the Gilmour's. Gilmour, after a first-round loss to the Oilers in '91, was not happy with his contract and decided to sit out. Doug Weisbrod, former Canadiens icon and Kitchener Ranger player, had no choice but to trade him away. And Toronto was looking for somebody because, after all, the Leafs were coming out of the darkness of Harold Ballard's reign. So Calgary decided to send Gilmour to Toronto for Gary Leeman. Now, that was the original trade, Gilmour for Leeman, because Gary Leeman was falling flat for the Leafs, and he was once a 50-goal scorer for them. So, yeah, it was there. But then both Riceboro and Toronto GM and former Calgary GM Cliff Fletcher actually ended up adding more to the details. If I can remember this without cheating, Gilmour was sent to Toronto with Jamie McCowan, no, is it Craig Berube? No, Berube was in Edmonton. Sorry. So it was Gilmour, McCowan, Rick Wamsley, Kent Manderville, and who else? Shit. I would say Michel Petit, but I can't say. I can't remember who the 5th player is off the top of my head. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. The Leafs sent back Gary Leeman, Alex Godunyak, Michel Petit, Jeff Reese, and Craig Berube. I forget who the 5th Toronto player was. Manderville. Yeah, I can't remember. I can't remember off the top of my head. Nevertheless, the 10-player trio was huge. I mean, the most players in one trade. And then worse for Calgary is that Doug Gilmour ended up helping the Leafs out in their situation and getting them to a couple of deep playoff runs in '93 and '94, whereas Calgary had regressed. They had not won. They did make the playoffs in the mid '90s, but they never won a playoff series from 1989 till 2004. That's how bad it was. Yeah, the Flames returned did not pan out, and the Leafs got the moves. I mean, Manderville was a decent player. McCowan was a good defenseman. And, well, Rick Wamsley was nothing much. Anyway, number 9, and one of the trades that did not make the best trade was Cam Neely to the Boston Bruins 1986. So the Vancouver Canucks had Cam Neely. Everyone knows Cam Neely from either being his career with the Boston Bruins or from that Dumb and Dumber movie, or was it? Yeah, Dumb and Dumber. Who's the dead man who hit me with the head with a salt shaker? Nevertheless, Cam Neely was an icon. He was a Vancouver Canuck for years, and people forget about that. Then the Canucks decided to get the one of a former 50-goal scorer for the Bruins named Barry Pedersen. So they decided to trade Cam Neely and a first rounder to Boston to get Pedersen. Didn't work out. Pedersen bounced around. I was cut with the Hartford Whalers of '91, and they traded away Cam Neely. Now, the Canucks also, that first round pick also bit them in the butt because that was Glenn Wesley, who was a serviceable defenseman for Boston and Carolina. But yeah, Cam Neely turned to be a superstar, 50 goals in a few seasons. He was Boston's star winger until Ulf Samuelsson took the knees out of Cam Neely and ruined his career. Cam Neely became a Hall of Famer. Vancouver basically got bit. Number 8, another one of those trades that did not make the best list was Phil Kessel from Boston to Toronto 2009. The Leafs really needed some help. Coming out of the 2005 strike, they had not been to the playoffs for a few years. They had a close run in 2007, losing on the final day of the season. Well, not by playing, but by having the New York Islanders beat the Devils in the shootout. Nevertheless, the Leafs, were looking big, and they thought Phil Kessel was available. Boston made him available. Kessel was coming off testicular cancer and actually winning the Masterton Trophy for perseverance in hockey. So the Leafs just had to have Kessel. So they decided to trade 2 first-round picks and a second-rounder for the one of Phil Kessel. It worked out in a sense. Kessel was a good goal scorer for the Toronto Maple Leafs and was pretty good and all that. Unfortunately, though, it didn't lead them to playoff success. They did not win a playoff series when Kessel played for the Leafs. Worst of all was that, the Leafs trading 2 first-round picks and a second-round pick to Boston. I don't know what happened to the second-round pick, but the 2 first-round picks that the Bruins got from the Leafs were Tyler Seguin and Dougie Hamilton, both serviceable players. Because, Tyler Seguin was known for a Dallas Stars outfit. But, the Leafs were second worst in the NHL in 2009 and had to give up the number 2 draft pick to Boston. This was the Taylor Hall year that Taylor Hall was picked first by the Oils. And then Dougie Hamilton, good defenseman who would do well for Calgary as well. But, the Leafs lost their chance to get Seguin and Hamilton. They could have built off of them. What's even worse is that this wasn't the first and probably not the last time the Leafs trading a first-round pick bit them in the ass. As I mentioned in the best trades, in 1991, I offhandedly said about the Leafs trading away their first-round pick in 1991, well, in 1989, to the Devils for Tom Kurvers, a power play quarterback. For the one of that, the Leafs were the second worst team in the NHL. They had the number 3 pick in 1991 because the Sharks were coming in the league and getting the number 2 pick. Devils picked, lo and behold, Scotty freaking Niedermayer. But it bit them in the butt. Seguin and Hamilton could have been decent. The Leafs, Kessel did make the 2013 playoffs, but unfortunately, though, Kessel was ineffective against his former team. And then left for Pittsburgh in a massive trade that actually helped Pittsburgh out, getting Kessel a pair of Stanley Cups in 2016 and 17. If that wasn't worse enough for the Leafs. And, it just bit them. Number 7 is Daniel Chara and the number 2 pick from the Islanders to the Senators 2001. The New York Islanders were going through a lot of things. Mike Milbury was a terrible general manager. He was a decent defenseman for the Bruins as a player. Of course, we all know about the shoe incident, or you should know. Google 1979 Bruins Rangers for that. Nevertheless, he made some questionable moves. One questionable move, not on this list, was trading away Roberto Luongo to Florida for what seemed to be the number 1 draft pick, which they took Rick DiPietro, who was injury prone, and after signing that 15-year contract, was the shit. Nevertheless, the Islanders decided to one-up it in 2001. They had the number 2 pick in the draft, which isn't half bad. 2001, I can't remember. Was that the Danny Heatley? Who was 2001 number 1? I would say Kovalchuk, but I think it was Kovalchuk. Nevertheless, the Islanders traded that number 2 pick to Ottawa. Alongside things, they wanted Alexei Yashin. Because Yashin held out of Ottawa for that 1 year and, could have helped Ottawa out, but he became a malcontent, if you will. So Ottawa traded Yashin to the Islanders. The Islanders we'll take him. Unfortunately, he didn't do well with the Islanders. What's even worse was that the trade that the Islanders sent to Senators, they sent the number 2 pick, Bill McCult, who really wasn't big in Ottawa. He would be better in Minnesota. And this defenseman, 6'9", the tallest player to make the NHL Hall of Fame. Yes, that guy. So Daniel Chara. Chara was an Islander for a few years and then went to the Senators to become a pretty good defenseman in his own right before he became mega D in Boston. Metro Ottawa wished they had not traded Chara to Boston. Regardless, the number 2 pick became this guy from the Mississauga Ice Dogs who would be dazzling for Ottawa and actually make an appearance in a Leafs jersey. His name, Jason Spezza. So Milbury traded away Chara and Spezza to Ottawa for the one of Alex Yashin, who had nothing left in the tank. Number 6 is younger Yager to the Washington Capitals 2001. We talked about Yager being to Pittsburgh through some draft trade chicanery, but the fact of the matter is that he also was part of a terrible trade. Pittsburgh had done well with Yager and all that. Yager won 2 Stanley Cups in his first 2 years in the league. He was doing well alongside Mario Lemieux, and then once Lemieux retired, it was basically Yager's team. Yager could not lead the team to playoff success and all that. And after a 2001 playoff run that saw Lemieux go back from the owner's box to an NHL player and shock Buffalo as an 8 seed or something like that. Well, they shocked Buffalo with Darius freaking Kasper Rice scoring a goal. Pittsburgh went to the conference finals, lost to the Devils, who then lost to the Avalanche. Nevertheless, Yager was seen as problems. Pittsburgh figured their contract problems with Yager was not going to be there, and with Lemieux back, they could save on money. And of course, they were going through bankruptcy protection and all that. So they traded Yager to Washington for Chris Beach, who was supposed to be this big guy, but he was better as a defenseman. I mean, as a minor leaguer. Michael Civic and Russ Lupacek. None of them matched Yager's talent. Pittsburgh lost a franchise icon for little return, and then Yager would do okay for Washington before trading to the Rangers and making them look decent for a few seasons. And Lemieux would retire 5 years later. But Pittsburgh sucked so badly, they did get the number 1 draft pick with Marc-Andre Fleury and Sidney Crosby, so that worked, I guess. Number 5 is a trade I talked about, the best trades, Mark Messier to the Rangers. Now, this is from Edmonton's POV. Mark Messier came over in the 1979 draft, well, from the WHA to the NHL through the draft. Messier and Gretzky were a great 1-2 pairing, which lasted until Gretzky got traded to LA in 1988, and we'll talk about that later. But Messier did help the Oilers win the Stanley Cup in 1990. Unfortunately, though, his contract negotiations were terrible, and his father, Doug, who was his own agent, basically said that Mark shouldn't take the deal, so he was prepared to sit out. However, a few days after the 91 season started, the Oilers balked and decided to trade Messier to New York for 3 players: Bernie Nichols, Stephen Rice, Kitchener. Yeah, that's right. Stephen Rice, Kitchener Rangers, and Team Canada World Junior icon in 1991, and Louis DeBrusque. DeBrusque would do decently as a goon and a hockey night in Canada, analyst for the Oilers. Bernie Nichols, well, he was good. I mean, the Kings traded him to the Rangers for Tony Granato, and then he went from the Rangers to the Oilers. But Bernie Nichols would do okay for Edmonton before being traded to Chicago and a few other teams. Marc Moose Messier was just pure enjoyment and all that. Edmonton had traded Messier for little return. I mean, Stephen Rice was nothing for the Oilers, nothing. Bernie Nichols, as I said, not much. Yeah, and Messier would help the Rangers win the President's Trophy for team best regular season mark in 1992, and then 2 years later, would a trade I talked about, the best trades of all time, and that's Thornton to the San Jose Sharks, 2005. From Boston's point of view. So Boston drafted Joe Thornton first overall in 1997. It was actually the first time the Bruins had missed the playoffs since 1968, if you can believe it. But yeah, in 97, and he was underwhelming. He was named captain, but the Bruins couldn't go anywhere in the playoffs, so they basically blamed Joe Thornton. And a few weeks after the 2005-06 season started, they weren't happy with him and found a trading partner with the San Jose Sharks. So they decided to trade Thornton, their star center, if you will, to the Sharks for Marco Sturm, Brad Stewart, and Wayne Primo. Marco Sturm would be okay for the Bruins. He did help them win the 2010 Winter Classic against Philly, but that was all. Brad Stewart didn't do that much, and Wayne Primo either. Thornton was paired up with Jonathan Cheechoo, helping Cheechoo score 56 goals, the most in the NHL that year. And Thornton shocked everyone by becoming the first player in history to actually be traded mid-season and win the Hart Trophy for MVP. It was just amazing and all that. Thornton would spend, I think, 10 plus more years in the Shark tank. And, he became a Leaf for a few years. But nevertheless, Joe Thornton was just pretty good. And the Sharks could hang their hat on this guy. Number 3 is Patrick Waugh to the Avalanche. This was terrible for Montreal. They drafted Patrick Waugh 51st overall in 1984. And We're hoping he was good. His first full season, 85-86, he shared the crease with Doug Soltart and Steve Penny, but he was named the goalie in the playoffs and helped them win the 1986 Stanley Cup. At age 20 plus, he got them the cup, which was pretty good. Wall would be Montreal's money goalie, if you will, in the playoffs. 93, he almost was dumped off for Andre Red Light Rasico in the Nets against Quebec after losing the first two games of the series. But Wall had Jacques Demers, the coach, in his corner and pulled it out, and Montreal won 10 playoff games in overtime and won the Stanley Cup in 93. Unfortunately, a few years later, Montreal dumped Jacques Demers after a 0-5 start and put Mario Tremblay in the net. Everyone was shocked because Mario Tremblay was just known for being a color commentator on Radio Canada or CBC French's Montreal Canadiens broadcast. So anyway, Mario was named there, and Réjean Houle, known as Peanut, was become general manager. Unfortunately, though, there was a lot of friction and all that. Apparently, Mario Tremblay got under Patrick Roy's skin, funny bone, by saying we need to play toast to toes with the Toronto Maple Leafs instead of saying toe to toe, toast to toast, and making him laugh. Nevertheless, Patrick Roy was pretty good and all that. And unfortunately, though, December 2nd, 1995, the last time the Red Wings would visit the famous Montreal Forum before it would be turned into the Bell Center by March. They came in, they were the top team in the NHL. They scored 11 goals, 9 on Patrick Roy, and, it was just amazing. Like wasn't Larry Enoff who had a hat trick? Someone had a hat trick. Or was it I think it was Slava Kozlov, I think. But nevertheless, no, I think it was 13. Who was 13? No, Larionov or Fetisov. I think it was Slava Kozlov. But anyway, nevertheless, Waugh was put in the net to dry. Like, he was hung out to dry. I mean, you give up 5 goals in the first period, you get rid of Waugh, maybe you put him back for the third period. But no, Tremblay let him go through 9 goals. Waugh was finally mercifully pulled for Pat Jablonski, and of course, Mario Tremblay kind of had a smug look when Patrick Waugh went past him to go to the backup goalie's stool. Waugh turned around, went past Tremblay again, and yelled at the president of the Montreal Canadiens, Ronald Corey, saying this would be his last game in Montreal. And so, basically there. Tremblay did say that he should have taken Waugh out after 5 or 6 goals, but he was trying to give Waugh some encouragement. Not so fast. Montreal was painted in the corner. Waugh was kicked off the team, but then he was traded to Colorado alongside Captain Mike Keane, who also kind of laughed at Mario Tremblay's joke about the Leafs. In exchange, the Avalanche, former Nordiques, gave him Jocelyn Thibault, Martin Rushinsky, Andrei Kovalenko. Rushinsky was good for the Canadians, not great. Kovalenko, not so much. And Thibault would have to go through the shadow of Montreal goalies and all that. French-Canadian goalies in Montreal. The joke was on Montreal. They did make the playoffs in 96, were up 2-0 on the Rangers, and choked it. But Patrick Roy would get the last laugh, helping Colorado win the Stanley Cup in 1996 over the Florida Panthers, taking out Detroit in the conference finals, and, sticking it to the Red Wings. Maybe the Red Wings shouldn't have put Patrick Roy so badly. Well, Waugh was traded to the West during conference because Montreal didn't want Waugh to ruin them while being in the Eastern Conference. Well, the joke was on them. Waugh would win the 2001 Stanley Cup, become a Colorado Avalanche icon in the Nets, and Montreal would have to try to recover. All right. At number 2 is the big trade between the Bruins and the Rangers, 1975. Phil Esposito and Ken Hodge heading to the Rangers for Brad Park and Jean Martel. So Boston picked up Phil Esposito in a crazy trade that I mentioned in my best moves in 1967, as the Chicago Blackhawks with Tommy Ivan actually thought that Espo was a little bit lazy. So they decided to get rid of him to Boston alongside Fred Stanfield for Pitt Martin, Jack Norris, and Jules Morant. So anyway, it bit Chicago in the butt. They were struggling in the early 70s, and Espo with Bobby Orr were helping the Bruins do well in the 1970s and winning a pair of Stanley Cups, and Espo and Orr were always in the top 5 of scoring. The New York Rangers were, right in 1975. They looked pretty good, but they couldn't beat their crosstown rivals, the New York Islanders, in the playoffs. So anyhow, the Rangers were looking for something, and Emile Francis had been left off the team. Like the Rangers got rid of him, and with a new legacy. Boston was going nowhere too. So Boston and New York made a kind of a move, one legend for another, as Phil Esposito would be traded to the Rangers for Brad Park in essence. But also the Rangers would also get Ken Hodge Sr. Ken Hodge Jr. was a one season pony with the Boston Bruins. But anyway, yeah, with Ken Hodge Sr. So, and the Rangers would also get rid of Sean Rattel to the Bruins alongside Joe Sanusi, who was his defenseman, who was a throw-in, if you will. So it was Espo's powerful goal scoring and Ken Hodge's offensive firepower to the Rangers for Brad Park's great defensive work. Jean Rattel should not be traded from the Rangers, and Joe Sanusi. So who won the trade? Well, the Bruins went to a pair of Stanley Cups in 1977 and 78, fell to the Canadiens. The Rangers in 79 went to the Stanley Cup Finals, but fell to the Habs. So both these teams fell to the Habs in the few years. But yeah, Boston got stung losing Espo's firepower, and Espo almost kiboshed the deal, refusing to play for the Rangers. But the Rangers were hell bent on getting Phil Esposito and all that. They even made him captain, which Espo said was not a good idea. Boston would pick up Brad Park and Sean Rattel and ride them to a pair of Stanley Cup finals, as I said. And it almost worked. They almost became Stanley Cup champs. But poor Phil Esposito would not win, win anything with the Rangers. He did get them to the 79 finals, but still, it's just brutal. And number one, you can probably guess, is the Wayne Gretzky trade. This was one heck of a trade for the Edmonton Oilers. Gretzky was a WHA icon for Indianapolis before being traded to Edmonton before the franchise folded. So, the Oilers had Wayne Gretzky. They kept him along from the WHA. And anyway, that's what happened. The Oilers would trade things. But yeah, the Oilers, 4 Stanley Cups in a 5-year period. Gretzky was looking good, and it looked like Edmonton was going to be hockey town, city of champions. Unfortunately, Payer Pocklington of the Oilers Brain Trust was losing money on a trade on his stuff, so he needed money fast, and Los Angeles was willing to give him $15 million to help him out from Bruce McDowell, who we would soon learn had some illegal coin trading stuff and borrowing and got imprisoned for 4 years. So the Oilers decided to trade Gretzky to LA. Well, mostly because Janet Jones, his wife, was actually a Hollywood actress. People hated that move. They hated Gretzky's move to Janet Jones, calling Jones a Jezebel. But yeah, so Gretzky was traded alongside Mike Krushelewski and Barney McSorley to LA for Jeremy Carson, Martin Gelinas, 3 first-round picks, which ended up being shit, and cash. So yeah, so the Oilers traded away Mike Krushelewski, who had a famous overtime goal to eliminate the Flames in 1990. But other than that, what do you have? Little to anything. So yeah, you got Gretzky and all that, but yeah. And Martin McSorley was only sent to LA at Gretzky's request because he needed an enforcer. And it worked out. McSorley was good in the silver and black. Of course, this was the first year the Kings would go silver and black after dumping their purple and gold stuff. So yeah, so Martin Gelinas would actually be good for Edmonton a couple years later, part of the kid line with Joe Murphy and Adam Graves winning the Stanley Cup as an Oiler. Bet you didn't know Adam Graves won the Stanley Cup as an Oiler. Anyhow, so yeah, and Jimmy Carson, great player for the Kings, scoring lots of goals, but unfortunately, Carson did not like Northern Alberta one bit and forced a trade to Detroit a season after he was traded to the Oilers. So, yeah. That Detroit trade was big because it brought Peter Klima and Joe Murphy from the Red Wings. So, it helped Edmonton by getting rid of the cancer known as Jimmy Carson. So, the return was just not great. And worst of all, Canada really felt the effects of it because not only was Gretzky, Canada's greatest export, if you will. But the fact of the matter for Gretzky is that he freaking, you know, brought hockey greatness in southern United States, which I cannot have and all that because Gary Bettman is hell bent on making the southern U.S. steam good, including not allowing Arizona to lose the team, even though they lost it to Utah. So anyhow, the Gretzky trade really ruined a country, which was Canada, because our greatest export would be traded. It was so bad that Parliament, our Canadian Parliament, tried to block it, but to no avail. Anyhow, I'm Jeff Diamond to do.